They thought the pressure would work. For months, the message from Washington had been clear, loud, and repeated often enough that it began to sound like a certainty. Trade would be used as leverage. Access would be used as influence. Proximity would be used as advantage. Because for decades, that formula had worked. Canada was close, deeply integrated, economically intertwined in ways that made separation almost unthinkable. Which is why no one expected what happened next. Not because Canada fought back, but because it didn't. It simply stepped sideways, and in doing so, made the pressure irrelevant. There was no dramatic confrontation, no angry speeches, no televised disputes, no public defiance. Just a quiet series of moves that had one unexpected effect. The threats that once sounded powerful suddenly had nowhere to land. Because they relied on an assumption that had quietly stopped being true. That Canada needed the United States in the same way it always had. For years, Washington had operated with a comfortable belief that trade pressure worked best on neighbors who had no real alternatives. That proximity created dependence. That dependence created leverage. And that leverage could be used whenever negotiations became difficult. This logic had held for decades, until Canada began preparing for a world where that logic no longer applied. What makes this moment so fascinating is that nothing Canada did looked dramatic. No one watching headlines would have seen it as resistance. It looked like modernization, diversification, economic prudence. But underneath, those moves did something far more significant. They reduced the effectiveness of a strategy Washington had relied on for years. Because once a country quietly builds alternative trade pathways, alternative markets, and alternative supply routes, the old pressure points stop working. Not because of confrontation, but because of preparation. This is where the story changes. Because Washington's approach had always depended on Canada being tightly locked into a system that offered little room to maneuver. But Canada had spent years creating maneuvering room. And by the time the threats came, that room already existed. The threats didn't fail because Canada resisted them. They failed because Canada had already moved beyond the conditions that made those threats effective. This is what observers later described as a strategic embarrassment. Not public humiliation, but the kind that happens when a plan meets a reality it did not anticipate. Because once Canada showed it could function comfortably outside the narrow boundaries Washington had assumed, the tone of the entire relationship shifted. For decades, North America operated like a single economic machine. Trade flowed naturally. Supply chains overlapped. Policies aligned closely enough that long-term planning felt easy. That closeness created comfort. And comfort created confidence in how pressure would work if needed. But confidence depends on old patterns continuing. And Canada had quietly been preparing for new patterns long before anyone noticed. By the time Washington began signaling trade pressure, Canada had already reduced the degree to which that pressure mattered. Not loudly, not defiantly, just structurally. This is why the moment felt so sudden. Because from Washington's perspective, nothing had changed. But from Canada's perspective, everything already had. And that mismatch is what caused the collapse of the strategy. Because strategies built on outdated assumptions do not fail gradually. They fail all at once, the moment they meet reality. Most people never saw this coming, because it did not look like a fight. It looked like routine economic planning. But inside that planning was a quiet shift that made old forms of leverage far less effective than they once were. And by the time this became obvious, the direction had already been set. The pressure had already lost its force. And the relationship had already entered a new phase, where old tools no longer worked the way they used to. Next, what made this shift so difficult to recognize at first was how ordinary everything looked on the surface. Trade numbers still moved. Trucks still crossed the border. Factories still relied on parts from both sides. Nothing appeared broken. But the real change was not visible in motion. It was visible in options. Because Canada had spent years building options. And options change how a country responds to pressure, even if it never says so publicly. For decades, proximity to the United States had shaped Canada's economic posture. It made sense to align closely. It made sense to depend heavily. It made sense to build systems that flowed naturally south and north, without much thought. But once global trade began feeling less predictable, Canadian planners started asking questions that had never been asked seriously before. What if dependence becomes a vulnerability? What if proximity limits flexibility? What if resilience requires diversification? Those questions did not lead to confrontation. They led to preparation. Preparation that looked like modernization, efficiency, and long-term economic planning. But underneath, it was something more subtle. Reducing exposure to any single trade partner's pressure. This is where the shift quietly accelerated. New trade relationships explored, new markets emphasized, new supply routes strengthened, new agreements signed that widened economic pathways in directions that had rarely been prioritized before. None of these moves were framed as distancing from the United States. They were framed as sensible diversification. And that is what made them so effective. Because no one can criticize a country for wanting more options. As these options grew, something else changed quietly. Canada no longer had to view every trade discussion through the lens of dependency. It could negotiate from a position of choice. And a country negotiating from choice behaves very differently from a country negotiating from necessity. This is where Washington's strategy began to feel outdated without anyone realizing it at first. Because the pressure tools it relied on had been designed for a version of Canada that no longer existed. A version that had fewer alternatives. Fewer routes, fewer markets, fewer ways to maneuver. But Canada had spent years expanding all three. So when the pressure arrived, it did not land with the weight Washington expected. It met a country that had quietly built room to move. Room that had not been visible from the outside. This is what made the moment so surprising. Because the strategy did not collapse due to resistance. It collapsed because the conditions it depended on had already changed. For Washington, this realization was uncomfortable. Not because Canada had acted aggressively, but because it showed how much of its planning relied on assumptions that had never been updated. As next, assumptions that had once felt permanent. Assumptions built in a time when trade was stable, predictable, and largely insulated from political pressure. But the world had changed. And Canada had adjusted quietly, long before Washington realized it needed to. This is why the collapse felt so sudden. From the outside, it looked like pressure had simply stopped working overnight. But in reality, the ground underneath that pressure had been shifting for years. Canada had not rejected the relationship. It had rebalanced it. For decades, leverage had flowed naturally from size and proximity. The United States was larger. Its market was deeper. Its access mattered more. That imbalance shaped negotiations in subtle ways. But leverage only exists when the other side lacks alternatives. And alternatives were exactly what Canada had been building. By the time trade threats entered the conversation, Canada was no longer negotiating from dependence. It was negotiating from flexibility. And flexibility absorbs pressure. This is the part that rarely makes headlines. Because leverage does not disappear with a press release. It disappears quietly as options multiply. And once it is gone, no amount of rhetoric can bring it back quickly. Inside Washington, this created a moment of recalibration. Not panic, not outrage, but recognition. Recognition that the old playbook was being used against a new reality, because strategies designed for a tightly bound economic neighbor do not work the same way when that neighbor has diversified its trade pathways. Pressure points soften, threats lose urgency, and the balance of negotiation changes tone. This is why observers later described the moment as an embarrassment. Not because anyone lost face publicly, but because the strategy revealed itself as outdated, built for a world that no longer existed. Canada did not win by confronting Washington. It won by preparing quietly, by modernizing its trade posture, by building resilience before it was needed. And that is what made the shift so effective. Because by the time pressure arrived, Canada had already moved beyond the conditions that made pressure effective in the first place. Most people never noticed this transition because it did not look dramatic. But in strategic terms, it was decisive. It marked the moment when old leverage stopped working, not through resistance, but through irrelevance. And once leverage becomes irrelevant, the entire relationship enters a new phase. One where assumptions must be rewritten, and where influence can no longer be taken for granted. And that new phase is harder to navigate than open conflict, because conflict is loud, predictable, easier to frame. Quiet shifts are not. They force planners to confront something far more uncomfortable than resistance: irrelevance. When leverage fails loudly, it can be recalibrated. But when leverage fades quietly, it leaves no clear point of correction, no moment to respond, no action that suddenly restores balance, because the balance has already moved. This is what made the moment so unsettling inside Washington. Not that Canada had pushed back, but that it no longer needed to. The absence of reaction was the reaction. For decades, trade pressure had worked not because it was used often, but because it could be used. Its mere possibility shaped negotiations. But that power depends on the other side believing there are no good alternatives. Canada no longer believed that. This realization forced a deeper question inside American strategy circles. How many other partners have quietly been building similar options? Because if Canada could do this without confrontation, others could too. And if that is true, then the tools that once shaped global trade dynamics may be losing effectiveness more broadly. This is why the story matters beyond Canada, because it signals a shift in how smaller or mid-sized economies think about resilience in an unpredictable trade environment. They are no longer waiting to see how pressure is applied. They are designing systems that make pressure harder to apply in the first place. This is not defiance. It is adaptation. And adaptation is far more difficult to counter. The United States did not suddenly lose influence, but it encountered the limits of influence built on outdated assumptions. Assumptions formed in a world where trade relationships felt stable and permanent. That world is fading. Canada's quiet shift exposed that reality. Not by challenging it, but by moving beyond it. And once one partner demonstrates that leverage can be neutralized through preparation rather than confrontation, the lesson spreads. Not through speeches, not through headlines, but through planning documents and long-term strategy. This is how power changes in the modern world. Not through dramatic breaks, but through quiet adjustments that slowly make old tools less effective. Until one day, those tools are still being used and no longer working. That is what happened here. Not humiliation in the public sense, but something more consequential. A reminder that influence is only as strong as the assumptions it rests on. And when those assumptions change quietly, influence must change with them, whether it is ready to or not. And once that realization settles in, another uncomfortable truth follows. Pressure only works when it is expected. When both sides enter a conversation already knowing where the limits are, where the pain points lie, and who is supposed to blink first. For years, Washington believed those limits were clearly defined. Canada was close, integrated, economically bound in ways that made walking away costly. That belief shaped tone. It shaped confidence. And confidence shaped how threats were framed. But the moment Canada demonstrated that it had quietly expanded its room to maneuver, something subtle changed. The conversation stopped being about whether pressure would work
and started becoming about whether it still mattered. Thoughtful, That is a very different position to negotiate from, because leverage does not disappear all at once. It erodes. It weakens at the edges. It loses sharpness long before anyone notices it is no longer effective.
And by the time it is tested seriously, it is often already too late. This is what Washington encountered. Not resistance, but erosion. Inside policy circles, the tone began to shift. Not publicly, but internally. Questions that had never needed to be asked before suddenly became unavoidable. How exposed are we, really? How much of our strategy assumes compliance that is no longer guaranteed? How many of our tools depend on a version of North America that may already be outdated? These are not questions you ask lightly, because they imply something deeper. They imply that influence may no longer flow as easily as it once did. The uncomfortable part was that none of this could be blamed on Canada acting irresponsibly. Canada did not break rules. It did not challenge agreements. It simply behaved like a country adjusting to a more uncertain world, which made the shift harder to confront. Because how do you push back against prudence? How do you apply pressure to diversification without admitting that your leverage depends on others remaining dependent? That contradiction sits at the heart of this moment. Washington's strategy relied on stability. Canada's strategy relied on flexibility. And in a changing global environment, flexibility absorbs pressure far better than stability. This is why the threats collapsed so quickly. Not because they were empty, but because they were aimed at a structure that no longer existed in the same way. For years, North American trade had been treated as a single organism. Highly efficient, deeply interconnected, almost automatic. That made it powerful, but it also made it fragile. Because when one part of the organism begins developing independent pathways, the whole system becomes harder to control from a single point. Canada's quiet diversification did exactly that. It created alternate routes, alternate markets, alternate dependencies, none of which replaced the United States entirely, but enough of which reduced the cost of disagreement. And cost is what determines how pressure feels. This is where Washington miscalculated. It assumed that disagreement would still be expensive for Canada. What it failed to see was that Canada had been quietly lowering that cost for years. So when the moment arrived, the pressure did not land with the expected weight. It landed on a surface that had already been reinforced. From the outside, it looked sudden, almost embarrassing. Threats issued, confidence projected. And then, nothing. No escalation, no collapse. Just a quiet continuation of business that made the threats feel strangely irrelevant. That silence was the signal. Because in geopolitics, silence after pressure is not calm. It is insulation. And insulation is dangerous for anyone relying on leverage. Because leverage depends on exposure. Once exposure decreases, leverage becomes theoretical, and theoretical leverage does not shape outcomes. This forced a reassessment that went deeper than Canada. Because if Canada could quietly neutralize pressure through preparation rather than confrontation, others could too. Not tomorrow, not loudly, but over time. This is where the story expands, because Washington began to realize that what it was seeing with Canada might not be unique. It might be part of a broader shift. A shift where partners are no longer waiting to see how pressure will be applied, but are instead building systems that make pressure harder to apply in the first place. That realization changes everything, because it means influence is no longer about who can apply the most pressure. It becomes about who others feel safest depending on. And safety, once questioned, is difficult to restore. This is why the collapse of the threats mattered, not because of optics, but because of precedent. It showed that pressure, once neutralized quietly, does not regain its power easily. It showed that the old tools still exist, but may no longer work the way they once did. For Canada, the moment passed without drama. Trade continued. Diplomacy remained calm. Nothing needed to be said, because the point had already been made without words. For Washington, the moment lingered, because it forced a confrontation not with Canada, but with its own assumptions. Assumptions about proximity, about dependence, about how predictable even the closest partners really are in a world where uncertainty is becoming the norm. And once those assumptions begin to crack, strategy must change. Not publicly, but fundamentally. That is the real consequence of this moment. Not humiliation, but adaptation. The realization that influence can no longer rely on old patterns alone, and that pressure, without exposure, is just noise. What made this shift even harder to process was how normal everything looked afterward. There was no visible break in relations, no collapse in trade volumes overnight, no sudden headlines announcing a new era. From the outside, it looked like nothing had happened. But inside long-term planning, everything had. Because the moment pressure fails quietly, it does something dangerous to future strategy. It introduces doubt. And doubt is far more corrosive than opposition. Washington had spent decades refining a certain instinct, that when negotiations reached a certain point, leverage could be applied. That proximity created limits. That limits created compliance. This instinct was not ideological. It was practical. It had worked often enough to become part of institutional muscle memory. But muscle memory becomes a liability when the environment changes. And the environment had been changing for years. Global trade was becoming less linear, supply chains less centralized, partnerships less exclusive. Countries were no longer optimizing only for efficiency. They were optimizing for resilience. Canada was simply ahead of that curve, not by rejecting the United States, but by preparing for uncertainty before it demanded preparation. This is why the moment mattered beyond any single deal, because it exposed a gap between how Washington believed leverage still worked and how leverage was actually evolving in a world where alternatives were multiplying quietly. In the past, trade threats carried weight because the cost of defiance was clear. Lose access, lose markets, lose stability. But when a country has already reduced those risks, the threat changes character. it becomes a suggestion, not a pressure point. This is where the imbalance appeared. Washington was speaking the language of constraint. Canada was responding from a position of optionality, and those two languages do not translate well. The uncomfortable realization inside Washington was not that Canada had won anything. It was that the conversation itself had shifted. Pressure was no longer shaping outcomes in the way it once had. And that raised a deeper concern. If pressure doesn't land here, where else might it fail? This question began echoing quietly across policy circles, not as panic, but as recalibration. Because the United States still had influence, still had scale, still had enormous economic gravity. But gravity alone does not guarantee compliance when others have learned how to orbit differently. Canada's case illustrated something important. You do not need to break away to reduce dependence. You simply need to widen your options slowly enough that no one feels threatened while it happens. This is why the shift felt sudden to Washington, because diversification, done quietly, looks invisible until it is tested. And the first real test came when trade pressure entered the conversation. That test revealed a misalignment. Washington expected friction. Canada absorbed it. Washington expected urgency. Canada showed patience. Washington expected reaction. Canada showed continuity. That continuity was the signal. Because continuity in the face of pressure suggests insulation. And insulation is the enemy of leverage. Once this became clear, the implications began spreading outward. Not just about Canada, but about the broader model of influence that relied on integration as a source of control. For decades, integration had been a strength. It created efficiency. It created scale. It created mutual benefit. But integration also created assumptions. Assumptions about behavior. Assumptions about alignment. Assumptions about how far partners could realistically drift. Canada's quiet adjustment challenged those assumptions without confronting them directly. And that is what made it powerful. Because it forced Washington to confront a question it had not prepared for. What happens when partners remain integrated but no longer constrained? This is not an easy question to answer, because it means influence must be earned continuously, not assumed, not inherited from geography, not enforced through proximity. The old model relied on predictability. The new environment rewards adaptability. And adaptability favors those who prepare quietly rather than react loudly. This is why the collapse of the trade threats was not a moment. It was a signal. A signal that the balance between pressure and resilience is shifting. Not dramatically, not universally, but enough to matter. And once that signal is received, it cannot be unseen. Because every future strategy must now account for the possibility that partners are not as exposed as they once were, that they may have already done the work necessary to soften pressure before it ever arrives. This is the deeper tension underlying the story. Not Canada versus Washington, but old leverage versus new resilience. And resilience, once built, does not announce itself. It simply waits until the moment pressure arrives and quietly passes through without effect. What made this shift especially difficult to counter was that it did not violate any expectations on paper. No agreements were broken. No alliances were questioned. No lines were crossed. Everything Canada did fit neatly within the rules of responsible economic planning. And that is precisely why it worked, because pressure strategies depend on predictability, not legality. Washington could not object to diversification. It could not publicly criticize resilience. It could not frame preparation as defiance without undermining its own arguments about free markets and sovereign decision-making. So the response was muted, measured, quiet. But inside strategic planning, the impact was anything but small. The uncomfortable truth began to settle in. Leverage that cannot be used openly is leverage that weakens over time. Because if a tool cannot be applied without political cost, its credibility erodes. And once credibility erodes, so does influence. This is where the deeper recalibration began. Not about Canada specifically, but about the assumptions underpinning pressure-based strategies more broadly. Because Canada was not unique. It was simply the clearest example. Across the global system, countries were watching closely. Not for confrontation, but for outcomes. They were watching to see whether preparation could neutralize pressure without provoking retaliation. Canada had just demonstrated that it could. That lesson did not spread through speeches or declarations. It spread through internal memos, through planning documents, through quiet adjustments in how governments thought about exposure and dependence. This is how influence changes in the modern world. Not through dramatic shifts of power, but through 1,000 small decisions that reduce vulnerability. Until one day, leverage that once felt overwhelming begins to feel strangely limited. For Washington, this created a strategic dilemma. Doubling down on pressure risked accelerating diversification. Backing away risked acknowledging that pressure no longer worked as intended. Neither option was attractive, because both acknowledged a reality the old strategy had not prepared for. This is why the response was subtle, why rhetoric softened, why threats faded from the conversation. Not because they were withdrawn, but because they no longer shaped outcomes. And this is where the narrative of collapse comes from. Not collapse in the sense of failure, but collapse in the sense of relevance. A tool that still exists, but no longer commands the same response. For decades, the United States had benefited from being the default partner, the largest market, the deepest supply chain, the most reliable access point. That position created natural leverage. But leverage built on default status is fragile when alternatives begin to mature. Canada's quiet strategy accelerated that maturation. Not by replacing the United States, but by reducing the cost of disagreement with it. And that reduction changes everything. Because once disagreement becomes affordable, pressure loses urgency. And urgency is what gives threats their power. This is why the moment mattered far beyond trade. It signaled a shift in how power is managed, away from confrontation, away from dominance, toward insulation and choice. The old model assumed that influence flowed outward from strength. The emerging model shows that influence is constrained by how much others feel exposed to that strength. And exposure, once reduced, does not return easily. Canada did not humiliate Washington in the public sense. There was no spectacle, no dramatic reversal. But it demonstrated something more consequential: that preparation can quietly neutralize pressure without ever acknowledging it. That demonstration reshaped expectations, not just in North America, but in how mid-sized economies think about resilience in an increasingly unpredictable world. This is why the story does not end with Canada. It continues wherever countries are quietly investing in optionality, in diversification, in systems that reduce reliance on any single partner. Because each of those investments chips away at the effectiveness of pressure-based influence. Slowly, incrementally, almost invisibly. And one day, pressure that once shaped behavior becomes something else. A suggestion, a signal, a reminder of how things used to work. That is the real outcome of this moment. Not the collapse of a relationship, but the evolution of how influence is earned, resisted, and absorbed. Power did not disappear. It changed form. And those who adapt to that change quietly will shape the next phase of global strategy far more effectively than those who rely on tools built for a world that no longer exists. That is what this moment revealed. Not overnight, not loudly, but unmistakably. That is what happened here. Not humiliation in the public sense, but something more consequential. A reminder that influence is only as strong as the assumptions it rests on. And when those assumptions change quietly, influence must change with them, whether it is ready to or not.